The word left my mouth before I could stop it. Thanks, baby. It wasn't even directed at anyone specific. Just a reflex. The kind of thoughtless thing you say to a coworker who hands you a stack of napkins when your hands are full and you're already 3 steps behind on everything. Marcus had worked at Harlow's for 2 years. I'd called him that before. It meant nothing. It had always meant nothing. But the second the word left me, the air in the room changed. I didn't understand why at first. I was still balancing a tray of water glasses, still mentally running through the seating chart for table 9, still trying to remember whether the gentleman in the corner had asked for still or sparkling. My brain was doing 5 things at once, the way it always did on a Friday night when the restaurant was packed and short-staffed, and the kitchen was already running 20 minutes behind on 2 orders. Then I felt it. Not heard. Felt. Like the temperature dropped by 2 degrees in a radius around me, and every nerve ending in my body registered it before my mind caught up. I turned slowly. Gunwoo was looking at me. He was sitting exactly where he always sat when he came in. The private booth in the far left corner. The one that technically wasn't on the floor plan for regular reservations. The one that Marcus had quietly told me on my first week was just always available. The lighting there was slightly dimmer than the rest of the room. The angle made it so that whoever sat there could see the entire restaurant without being directly visible from the entrance. I'd thought it was a coincidence the first time. I didn't think that anymore. He wasn't leaning forward. He wasn't gripping anything. He was just sitting there with one arm resting along the back of the booth, his glass of scotch untouched in front of him, and his eyes on me with an expression I couldn't name, and wasn't sure I wanted to. His 2 men, the ones who always flanked the booth without ever sitting in it, the ones who wore suits that fit too well and never ordered anything, had gone very still. I made myself look away, turned back to the tray, took 3 steps toward table 9. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me, because my heart was doing something unreasonable. I had been working at Harlow's for 14 months. It was the kind of restaurant that sat in that specific tier of New York dining, where everything was tasteful and expensive without being flashy about it. Dark wood paneling, white linen, a bar that served cocktails with names you had to ask about. The clientele was mostly finance people, a few lawyers, the occasional visiting executive who'd been recommended the place by someone who knew someone. It was calm in a deliberate way, controlled. I had taken the job because I needed the income, and the hours were predictable. And I had told myself it was temporary, while I figured out what came next. After the marketing agency I'd worked at for 3 years, quietly dissolved into nothing, following a series of decisions made by people several floors above me. That had been 14 months ago. The temporary thing had quietly become my life. I was good at the job. Not in a way that anyone would have written home about, but in the way that mattered. I was fast. I was accurate. I remembered orders without writing them down for tables of 4 or less, and I didn't make the guests feel like they were being managed. Marcus had told me once that I had a naturally disarming quality, and I hadn't known what to do with that, so I just said thank you and kept moving. Gunwoo had first come in on a Tuesday, 6 months ago. I hadn't known who he was. That sounds naive now, but at the time it was just true. He'd been seated at that corner booth and I'd been assigned the section, and I'd approached the table the way I approached every table. Professional, easy, a little warm, but not excessive. And he had looked up at me with those dark eyes and said simply, "Water." Then the menu. Not rude, just precise. Like someone who had decided a long time ago that every word used should carry its full weight and no more. I'd brought the water. I'd brought the menu. He'd ordered the duck without asking about it. He'd left a tip that made me double-check the bill twice. He came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that. By the 3rd time, I'd noticed that people in the restaurant behaved differently when he was there. Not visibly, nothing you could point to specifically. But there was a quality of awareness that spread through the room when he walked in, like everyone had registered something at a frequency just below conscious hearing. The host moved faster. The manager straightened. Even the other guests, who had no reason to know who he was, seemed to lower their voices slightly without realizing it. I'd asked Marcus about it after the fourth visit. Marcus had been quiet for a moment, stacking clean glasses behind the bar, and then he'd said, "Just make sure his water is always full, and don't ask questions you don't need the answers to." Which was its own kind of answer. I learned his name from a reservation. Gunwoo Shin. The listing had no company affiliation, no contact number beyond a single line that routed to someone who answered and confirmed and offered nothing else. I'd typed the name into my phone once, late at night after a shift, and then I'd close the browser before the results fully loaded. Some things you don't need to know to already know. What I did know, from 6 months of Friday nights and the occasional Tuesday, was smaller and more specific. He drank scotch but rarely finished it. He ate slowly. He never touched his phone at the table, which was unusual enough that I'd noticed it the second time and never stopped noticing it. His men changed occasionally, different faces, same energy, same way of standing that made them look like they'd been placed there rather than arrived on their own. He spoke Korean on the rare occasions he spoke to them, low and brief, and whatever he said always produced immediate, quiet action. He had never been anything other than composed with me, polite even, in a stripped-down way that felt more like respect than courtesy. He said please when he ordered, which sounds like a small thing and isn't. He had also, in 6 months, never once looked at me the way he was looking at me right now. I refilled the water at table 9. I smiled at the couple sitting there. I took the sparkling versus still question back to the kitchen and sorted it out. I did all of this on autopilot, while something in the back of my mind kept tugging at me, insisting I was missing something, insisting the word I'd thrown at Marcus like loose change had landed somewhere it shouldn't have, and I didn't yet understand the weight of where it had fallen. When I came back out onto the floor, I glanced toward the corner booth without meaning to. Gunwoo's glass was still untouched. He was talking to one of his men now. Or rather, the man was talking, leaning in slightly with the posture of someone delivering information. But Gunwoo's eyes tracked to me the exact second I appeared. Not a glance, not a sweep of the room, directly to me, as if he'd known precisely where I'd emerge from and had simply been waiting. I looked away first. I always looked away first. That had become an unspoken rule between us over 6 months, one I wasn't sure either of us had formally agreed to. But tonight, for the first time, looking away didn't feel like enough. It was Marcus who came to find me near the server station 20 minutes later, and the expression on his face was careful in a way that made my stomach tighten before he said a word. "He asked for you," Marcus said. "For me specifically?" "By name, Amelia." I held the cloth I'd been using to wipe down glasses and said nothing for a moment. Gunwoo had never asked for me by name before. He'd always simply been seated in my section, and I'd always simply appeared, and that arrangement had functioned without either of us having to acknowledge it directly. "Did he say why?" I asked. Marcus gave me a look that suggested that was not a question he had thought to ask, and probably for good reason. I set down the cloth. I smoothed the front of my apron once, a habit that meant nothing but gave my hands something to do. Then I walked toward the corner booth, across the restaurant that had not actually gone quiet, but that felt quieter to me with every step, until I was standing at the edge of Gunwoo's table, with what I hoped was a completely normal expression on my face. He looked up at me. The tattoos at his collar were just visible above the open button of his shirt. Dark ink against his neck, intricate, the kind of work that took hours and meant something. I had never let myself look directly at them before. I wasn't entirely sure why I was looking at them now. "Sit down," he said. It wasn't a question. I sat down. That was the thing that surprised me most about myself in that moment. Not that he'd asked, but that I did it without hesitating. Some part of me had apparently already made the decision, before the rest of me had time to weigh in on it. I pulled out the chair across from him, the one that his men had quietly stepped away from without being told, and I sat down like I'd been invited to something I didn't fully understand, and had decided to accept anyway. The booth felt different from the inside. From the floor, working my section, it had always looked like just a table. Slightly removed, slightly dim, Nothing remarkable about the physical space itself. But sitting in it, I understood immediately why he always chose it. You could see everything from here. The entrance, the bar, the kitchen pass, the other tables, the street through the front glass. Every corner of the room was visible without effort. It wasn't just a preference for quiet. It was a position. Gunwoo hadn't moved. Both hands were resting on the table. Relaxed, open, no tension in them. And he was watching me with the same expression he'd had across the room. I still couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't anger. Anger had a heat to it that I could have recognized and worked with. This was something cooler and more deliberate, like he was running a calculation and had decided to let me watch him do it. "You've worked here how long?" he said. 14 months. "And before that?" I blinked. "Marketing. Why?" He didn't answer the why, just let the question sit there unanswered in the space between us, which I was starting to understand was something he did intentionally. He picked up his glass, finally, and took a slow sip of the scotch, and then set it down with the kind of care that people use with things they respect. "The man you called baby," he said. "Who is he to you?" My first instinct was to say nobody, because that was the truth, but the word felt suddenly too small and too large at the same time, and I was aware that I was being watched by someone who had probably spent a significant portion of his life evaluating the gap between what people said and what they meant. "A coworker," I said. It was a reflex. It didn't mean anything. Gunwoo looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I know that," he said, which made the entire conversation more confusing, not less. He dismissed his men with a single glance. I didn't even see the signal, just noticed suddenly that they had moved to a different position, further back, close to the wall near the hallway. And then we were as alone as two people can be in a crowded restaurant on a Friday night. I was aware, distantly, that I was still on the clock, that Marcus was covering my tables, that the manager, Derek, had seen me sit down and had chosen to say absolutely nothing about it, which told me everything about what Derek understood that I was still catching up to. "I'm going to be honest with you," I said, because I had decided somewhere during the walk across the restaurant that whatever happened at this table, I was going to be exactly myself. Not smaller, not softer, not more manageable. Just me. It was probably a foolish decision. I made it anyway. I don't know what I did wrong. You didn't do anything wrong. Then I don't understand why I'm sitting here. He turned his glass slightly with 2 fingers, a small rotation, watching the light catch the amber inside it. "You've been in my section for 6 months, he said. "You've been in my section," I corrected, before I could think better of it. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Not quite. But the line of his mouth changed in a way that made me feel like I'd passed something without knowing I was being tested. "You've been in my section for 6 months, he repeated, unmoved. "And I've watched you work. You're careful. You're observant. You don't miss things." I waited. "But you're also," he said, and paused. And in that pause I felt the strange, pulling quality of his attention like a physical thing, careless with certain words. I opened my mouth. "Not a criticism," he said, before I could speak. "An observation." The distinction felt important to him. I filed it away. The thing was, I understood, sitting there, that this conversation was not actually about Marcus, or the word I'd thrown into the air without thinking. It was about something that had no clean name yet, something that had been building quietly over 6 months of Friday nights and precise orders, and a corner booth with a sightline to every door. I understood it the way you understand things you haven't let yourself think directly. Sideways, in your peripheral vision, gone the moment you try to look at it straight. I folded my hands on the table. "What do you want from me?" I asked. He looked at me for a long time after that. Long enough that I heard the ambient noise of the restaurant come back into focus around me, a burst of laughter from the bar, the clean sound of silverware, someone asking for the check. And I had the odd sensation of the world continuing normally, while whatever was happening inside this booth existed in its own separate time. Nothing you haven't already given, he said finally, which made absolutely no sense, and which I thought about for the rest of the night. He let me go after that. Stood, and I hadn't noticed from across the room quite how tall he was, quite how much space he occupied when he rose to his full height, and said, "Your section is waiting," in a tone that was both a dismissal and something that felt, strange as it was, like a small act of consideration. Like he was giving me back the ordinary night I'd had before he'd interrupted it. I walked back across the restaurant, picked up my tray, said something normal to Marcus, who didn't ask anything, bless him. But twice more that night, before his table cleared out near 11, I felt that specific shift in the air that meant Gunwoo's attention had found me across the room. I didn't turn to confirm it. I didn't need to. He left a note with the bill, not his number. Not anything dramatic. Just 4 words on the back of the receipt, written in clean, unhurried handwriting that suited him somehow, like the penmanship of someone who had decided not to rush anything. "Be more careful, Amelia." I read it 3 times standing at the server station with the ambient noise of end-of-night breakdown happening around me, glasses clinking, chairs being pushed back, Marcus asking if I wanted to split a cab. The thing that bothered me most wasn't the note. It was how my name looked in his handwriting, how it looked like he'd written it before, like he'd practiced it, or like it had been living in his hand for a while already, just waiting for a reason to come out. I folded the receipt and put it in my apron pocket. Told Marcus I'd take the subway. The walk to the station was 4 blocks, and the night air was cold in that particular New York way that goes straight through whatever you're wearing and finds the back of your neck. And I walked fast with my chin down and my hands in my pockets, and that note sitting against my hip, like it weighed something. Be more careful. With what exactly? My words? My reflexes? The ordinary, careless warmth I'd been spreading around a restaurant for 14 months without thinking twice about it. Calling coworkers baby and meaning absolutely nothing by it. Being exactly as unguarded as a person can be when they've decided their job is just a job, and the people in it are just people? Because the problem, the actual specific problem I was only now letting myself acknowledge fully, underground in the yellow light of the 6 train, strap in hand, strangers pressed around me in the ordinary intimacy of a crowded subway car. Was that somewhere in the last 6 months? Gunwoo Shin had stopped being just a person to me. I couldn't say when it had happened. I couldn't point to a specific Friday and say that was the night something shifted. It had been gradual and quiet, and it had happened the way water moves under ice. Invisibly, consistently, and with more force than the surface suggested. The train moved through the dark tunnel. I thought about his handwriting. About the way he'd said my name out loud once. Just now, across a table I'd never sat at before. About 6 months of careful orders and untouched scotch, and the particular quality of being watched by someone who noticed everything and said almost nothing. I thought about the word I'd thrown at Marcus like it was nothing. Baby. And I understood, for the first time, why the air had changed. He didn't come in the following Friday. I noticed at 7:15, when the corner booth had been empty for 40 minutes past the time he usually arrived, and I had already refilled the water glasses at that table twice out of pure muscle memory before catching myself and feeling immediately ridiculous about it. I set the pitcher down, went back to my section, told myself it meant nothing because it didn't mean anything. People changed their routines. People had other places to be. People who ran whatever Gunwoo Shin ran certainly had Friday nights that had nothing to do with a restaurant on the Upper East Side, and a waitress who had been careless with a word. Marcus didn't say anything about it, which meant he'd noticed too. By 9 o'clock I had stopped looking at the door. Or I had stopped looking at the door in a way I was willing to acknowledge to myself, which is a different thing. The note was still in my apron. I had washed the apron twice since that night, and both times I'd taken the receipt out first, set it on the bathroom shelf, and then put it back when the apron was dry. I hadn't examined this behavior closely. I wasn't ready to. The shift ended at 11:30. I changed out of my uniform in the small staff bathroom and walked out into the November cold, and standing on the sidewalk directly outside the entrance, slightly to the left so as not to block the door, was one of Gunwoo's men. I recognized him immediately. The suit. The particular quality of stillness that all of them had. That watchful non-expression that was somehow distinct from blankness. He was looking at me without any pretense of looking at something else, which was almost more unsettling than if he'd tried to be subtle about it. "Ms. Amelia," he said. Just that. My name, with a formality that landed strangely on the cold air. "Yes," I said, because what else do you say? "Mr. Shin would like you to have this." He held out a card, thick, cream-colored, the kind of cardstock that costs more than it should. On it was a single phone number, handwritten, and below it in the same unhurried script from the receipt, "When you're ready." I took it. The man gave a small nod, the kind that closed a transaction, and walked to a black car that was idling at the curb, and the car pulled away before I'd fully processed what had just happened. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold holding a card that smelled faintly, I was probably imagining this, of whatever he wore. Something clean and dark that I'd been aware of peripherally for 6 months without letting myself name it. "When you're ready." Not "call me." Not "I want to see you." Not any of the dozen more direct things he could have written. Just that. A door left open with no pressure attached, which was somehow more difficult to ignore than a door being pushed. I waited 4 days. I'm not sure what I was waiting for exactly. Some kind of clarity that didn't come. Some settled feeling that would tell me I knew what I was doing. It didn't arrive. On the 5th day, a Tuesday, I was sitting at my kitchen table in my apartment in the Bronx with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, looking at the card propped against my salt shaker where I'd put it to stop carrying it around in my pocket, and I picked up my phone. He answered on the second ring. "Amelia," he said. Not hello. Not who is this. Just my name, like he'd been expecting it, like my number had already told him everything before a single word. "Hi," I said, and immediately felt the inadequacy of it, the way it sounded like I was a teenager calling a boy she liked, not a 31-year-old woman calling someone she had absolutely no clear reason to be calling. "I got the card." "I know." A short silence. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted in a way that made me sit up straighter without deciding to. "Why?" I asked. It was the only thing I actually wanted to know. He was quiet for a moment. I heard nothing in the background. No traffic, no voices, no ambient noise of any kind, as if wherever he was existed in a soundproofed separate world. "Because you sat down," he said. I thought about that. "That's it?" "That's enough." We met 3 days later at a coffee place in Midtown that I'd never been to, the kind of quiet, unremarkable spot that doesn't have a sign visible from the street and doesn't appear on any app's recommended list, but is clearly known to the right people because every table was occupied by someone who looked like they had somewhere more important to be and had chosen to be here instead. Gunwoo was already there when I arrived. Of course he was. I was 2 minutes early and he was already settled at a corner table. Not the darkest corner this time, but still angled toward the door, still positioned with that automatic, probably unconscious need to see everything that came in. He was wearing a dark coat over a gray shirt, no tie, and the tattoos at his neck were fully visible today, intricate and dark against his skin. And I made myself not stare at them for the same reason I made myself not stare at anything about him for too long, because staring implied something I wasn't ready to put a name to. He stood when I approached. I hadn't expected that. The small formality of it caught me off guard in a way that the card and the note and the man on the sidewalk hadn't, which said something about which gestures I'd built defenses against and which ones I hadn't. "You came," he said. "You seem surprised." "Not surprised," he said, and pulled out the chair across from him. "Glad." I sat down. He sat down. A server appeared almost immediately with water, still, without being asked, and I filed that away with everything else I'd been filing about how the world seemed to arrange itself around him without being asked. We talked for 2 hours. That surprised me more than anything. I had expected silence, or something close to it. Brief, weighted exchanges like the ones at the restaurant, where his words were few and carefully chosen, and the spaces between them did most of the work. And there was some of that. He was still not a person who spoke for the pleasure of hearing himself speak. But there was also something else underneath it. Something I hadn't been able to see from across a restaurant floor, which was that when he was actually interested in what you were saying, he listened in a way that felt almost startlingly complete. No phone, no glancing around the room, no half attention. He asked about the marketing job. Not with pity, just with genuine, practical curiosity. What had I done there? What had I been good at? What had it felt like when it ended? I told him more than I meant to, about the particular specific grief of losing something that wasn't quite what you'd wanted anyway. How that was somehow harder to justify than losing something you'd loved completely. He was quiet for a moment after that. The things that are hardest to mourn, he said, are the ones where you're not sure you had the right to love them in the first place. I looked at him. I had not expected that sentence from him. Not the insight of it. Not the quiet precision of it. Not the way it landed directly on something I hadn't managed to articulate to myself in 14 months of processing. I had the sudden, disorienting feeling of being seen by someone I hadn't given permission to look. Yeah, I said, and my voice came out slightly different than I intended. Exactly that. He didn't push it, didn't follow it up with anything that would have made it a bigger moment than it was. Just let it settle, and moved on to something lighter. And I spent the next 20 minutes talking about almost nothing, and feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly release. In a way I hadn't noticed they'd been holding. When we left, he walked me to the corner where I'd need to turn for the subway. His men were somewhere nearby. I'd clocked 2 of them at different points during the 2 hours, both at a distance that required attention to notice. But at the corner it was just the 2 of us in the cold, and he stopped before I did, and turned to face me. "I'll be at Harlow's on Friday," he said. I figured. "I wanted you to know in advance." I tilted my head slightly. "Why?" He looked at me with that expression I'd been trying to name for 6 months. And in the cold afternoon light of Midtown, I was finally close enough to read part of it. It wasn't possession, exactly, though there was something in that register. It wasn't desire, though that was somewhere in it too. It was more like recognition. The look of someone who had identified something and was being careful with it because he understood its value and didn't intend to be careless. "Because I don't want you to be caught off guard," he said. Then, after a pause, "By me." He said goodbye without touching me. The car was there before I'd taken 3 steps. I watched it pull into traffic and then stood at the corner for a moment longer than necessary, the cold working its way into my collar, thinking about that last sentence and how much it contained. By me. Like there were other things I should still be watching for. Like he was telling me, gently and without drama, that the world he came from had edges I hadn't seen yet, and that he intended to stand between me and them, and that this was both an offer and a warning, and the 2 things were not separable. I turned and walked toward the subway. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from a number I now had saved. "Get home safe." 3 words. I stared at them on the platform while the train came in, warm air rushing through the tunnel, strangers flowing around me, the ordinary city doing its ordinary thing on all sides. I typed back, "I always do." His response came before the doors closed. "I know. I've made sure of it." The doors shut. The train moved. I sat with my phone in my lap and that text on the screen, and the slow, arriving understanding that made sure of it was not a figure of speech. That some part of what I'd taken for safety, for ordinary luck, for the unremarkable texture of an unremarkable life, had not been unremarkable at all. I didn't sleep well that night, not because I was afraid, or not only because of that, but because the text sat in my head, the way certain sentences do when they rearrange something you thought was fixed. I've made sure of it. I kept turning it over, looking at it from different angles, trying to find the interpretation that made it feel smaller or less significant. And every time I arrived back at the same place, He had been watching over me in some capacity for longer than our conversations had existed. Before the coffee, before the note, before I'd ever sat down across from him in that booth. The question I couldn't answer was how long. I thought about the last 14 months with that new lens, and it was like looking at a photograph you'd seen 100 times, and suddenly noticing a figure in the background that had always been there. The cab that had pulled up exactly when I needed one on the night it rained, and my phone was dead. The man who had been leaning against the building across from my subway stop 3 or 4 times, who I'd categorized as a neighbor, without thinking about it. The time someone had followed me for half a block near the restaurant, and then simply stopped, as if they'd hit an invisible boundary. I was not naive enough to think that kind of attention was entirely comfortable. There was something in it that pressed against my sense of autonomy in a way I needed to sit with honestly, the feeling of being monitored that no one had asked my permission for. But there was also, and I didn't know what to do with this part, something underneath it that felt less like surveillance and more like a hand placed at the small of your back in a crowd. Present. Steady. Not controlling where you went, just making sure nothing knocked you over on the way. Both things were true at the same time. I was getting used to Gunwoo existing in that space where 2 contradictory things were true simultaneously, and neither one canceled the other out. Friday came. He arrived at 8, which was slightly later than usual. I saw the shift happen in the room, that particular collective adjustment, chairs straightening, voices dropping a register. And then he was walking through to the corner booth with the easy, unhurried movement of someone who had never needed to hurry because the world had learned to wait for him. He was wearing black again. He almost always wore black. The coat came off and one of his men took it without being asked. And Gunwoo settled into the booth, and his eyes found me across the room before I'd even started moving toward the table. I'd thought about this moment. I'd thought about whether things would feel different now. Whether whatever had passed between us over coffee would show up in some awkward way that made the restaurant feel complicated. Whether I'd be self-conscious. Whether he would be. He was not self-conscious. He was exactly the same. Composed, present, watching. Except that something in the quality of the watching had shifted. And it was the kind of shift you could only detect if you'd been paying attention for 6 months. Which I had. I brought the water. I brought the menu, though he didn't open it. "Duck," he said. "We're out of the duck tonight. Chef substituted a short rib." He looked up at me. "Is it worth having?" "Honestly, it's better than the duck." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The closest thing to one I'd seen from him in 6 months. Then the short rib. I wrote it down. Started to turn away. "Amelia." I stopped. "Sit with me when your section clears. After 9. It wasn't a question. It also wasn't the same kind of command that it might have been from someone else. There was no pressure in it, no expectation of automatic compliance. Just a statement of what he wanted, delivered plainly, leaving the decision with me. He had a way of doing that, of wanting things without making the wanting into a demand. "I'll see," I said. He nodded once, like "I'll see" was a perfectly satisfactory answer, which made me trust him slightly more than I already did. I sat with him at 9:15. Marcus covered the last of my tables with the air of someone who had decided this was simply part of his job now, and had made peace with it. And I slid into the booth across from Gunwoo, and accepted the glass of water a server brought without being asked, and thought, not for the first time, about how the infrastructure of his consideration was invisible until you started looking for it. "Tell me something you haven't told anyone," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "That's forward." "You answered my questions about your job. I want to know something real." I thought about deflecting. I thought about a dozen lighter things I could have offered that would have technically satisfied the question without satisfying him. Then I thought about the way he'd listened in that coffee shop, the completeness of it, and I decided to give him something honest. "I applied for a position at a communications firm 3 months ago," I said. "A real one, not a lateral move, director level. I made it to the final round." I paused. I withdrew my application. He was quiet, waiting. I told myself it was because the timing wasn't right. that I wasn't ready. I looked at the table. But the actual reason is that I got scared. Not of failing. Of getting it and then having it taken away again. Of building something and watching it come apart for the second time. I picked up my water glass, set it down without drinking. Which is a cowardly reason. It's a human reason, he said. Same thing, sometimes. He shook his head slightly. No, it isn't. He said it with a quiet certainty that wasn't reassurance. He wasn't trying to make me feel better, wasn't softening it. He just disagreed, plainly, and without apology, and the directness of it was somehow more comforting than anything consoling would have been. You should apply again, he said. It's been 3 months. Apply again, he repeated. I looked at him. You don't know anything about the position. I know you made the final round, he said, and I know you withdrew. Those are the 2 relevant facts. I started to say something, and then stopped, because I realized I didn't actually have a counter-argument. I just had the fear, and the fear wasn't a counter-argument. It was just a feeling, and sitting across from someone who appeared to be constitutionally incapable of making decisions based on feelings had a clarifying effect on me. Maybe, I said. He looked at me. Fine, I said. I'll think about it. He walked me out at 10:30, not all the way to the subway. I hadn't asked him to, and he hadn't offered, but to the door, through the restaurant, and I was aware of the room watching without watching, that ambient, careful attention that followed him everywhere. On the sidewalk, he stopped and turned up his collar against the cold, and for a moment we were just 2 people standing outside a restaurant at night, which was an ordinary enough thing in New York that nobody paid attention to it. The man from Tuesday, he said. Marcus. I blinked. What about him? He's been scheduling himself into your section on nights when I'm not here. I stared at him. How do you know Marcus's schedule? He held my gaze and said nothing, which was its own answer. I felt the dual sensation again, the mild vertigo of realizing the extent of his awareness, and underneath it, that same steady warmth I didn't entirely want to name. I pressed my lips together. Marcus is a coworker. I know that. Then why are you telling me? He was quiet for a moment. The city moved around us. A cab, a couple walking a dog, the ordinary November night. Because, he said, I want you to understand something. I waited. I don't make claims on things that aren't mine. He said it evenly, without heat, each word settled and deliberate. But I also don't pretend not to want what I want. The cold air sat between us. I could hear my own heartbeat with unusual clarity. And what is it you want? I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. He looked at me for a long moment. In the light from the restaurant window, I could see the details I usually only caught in pieces. The sharp line of his jaw, the ink at his throat, the dark eyes that had been watching me across this room for 6 months, before either of us had said anything real. You already know, he said. And the frustrating thing, the thing that kept me awake later, staring at my ceiling with the cold working through the windowsill, was that he was right. I did already know. I had known for a while, in that sideways peripheral way I'd been refusing to look at directly. He said goodnight. The car was there. He was gone in under 30 seconds, the way he always disappeared, completely, cleanly, no trailing edge. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then my phone buzzed. The firm is called Aldridge Communications. The position is still open. The hiring director's name is Patricia Weiss. I read it twice. 3 times. He had looked it up. He had looked it up either during dinner or before it, because he had expected this conversation or something like it, and he had come prepared with the specific information I would need to stop using ignorance as an excuse and actually do the thing I was afraid to do. I laughed once, a short surprised sound in the cold night air. Then I opened my laptop when I got home and found the listing for Aldridge Communications and started rewriting my cover letter, and I did it with a specific and unfamiliar feeling sitting in my chest, something between being known and being pushed. between being seen and being refused the comfortable smallness of staying unseen. I wrote until 1 in the morning. It was the best cover letter I'd ever written. I got the interview on a Wednesday. Patricia Weiss's assistant called at 10 in the morning, while I was still in my apartment, still in the oversized sweatshirt I'd slept in, halfway through a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I was reading the news. I said yes so fast that I had to repeat myself because she hadn't finished the sentence about available dates. She chose Thursday of the following week. I wrote it in my calendar in capital letters, and then sat at my kitchen table with my phone face down and my heart going at a pace that had nothing to do with the caffeine. I didn't text Gunwoo right away. I sat with it for a few hours, turning over the question of whether to tell him at all, whether doing so would mean something I wasn't prepared to define yet. Then I picked up my phone and typed, "I have an interview. Thursday." His response came in under a minute. "I know." I stared at that for a long moment. Then, because there was no version of me that was going to let that go without comment, "Of course you do." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Then, "You'll do well. Not good luck. Not I hope it goes okay." A simple declarative statement. The way he said everything, with no hedge and no qualifier, like the outcome was a thing he'd already accounted for and found acceptable. I put my phone down and went to find something appropriate to wear, and the whole time I was moving through my apartment, I had that feeling again. The one I'd been carrying for weeks now, warm and slightly dangerous, like holding something that ran on a current you weren't entirely sure was safe. The interview went well. Better than well. Patricia Weiss was sharp and direct, and she asked the kind of questions that cut through rehearsed answers and required you to actually think, and I found that I liked her immediately, in the uncomplicated way you like people who don't waste your time. I was in the building for 90 minutes. I walked out into the cold afternoon air feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just relieved, but capable. The specific, clean sensation of having done something difficult and done it well. I was 3 blocks from the Aldridge building, moving fast with the collar of my coat up and my mind already cycling through everything I should have said differently and everything I'd said right, when a black car slowed alongside me. The window came down. Gunwoo was in the back seat. I stopped walking. "Get in," he said. "Were you waiting outside the building this whole time? Get in, Amelia." I got in. The car was warm and quiet, and it pulled smoothly back into midtown traffic, and Gunwoo looked at me with that complete assessing attention and said, "How did it go?" "Good," I said. Then honestly, really good, I think. Something in his face settled, the way a held breath releases. It was so brief I almost missed it. But I'd been learning his face for months, the small vocabulary of its movements, and I caught it. "I told you," he said. "You told me I'd do well. The interview went well. Those aren't the same as getting the job." "They'll offer it to you," he said, simply, finitely. I turned to look at him fully. In the close space of the back seat, with the city moving past the window behind him, and the afternoon light finding the angles of his face, he was, I let myself acknowledge this directly for the first time, extraordinarily difficult to look away from. Not just because of how he looked, though that was certainly a factor that existed in the world and I was not going to pretend otherwise, but because of the quality of being near him, the specific gravity of someone who moved through the world like they had decided exactly what they were and had stopped negotiating with it. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He waited. "That night at the restaurant, when I called Marcus baby," I paused. "You said you knew it didn't mean anything. So what was it actually about? What was the thing that changed?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city scrolled past. "Before that night," he said, "I had a reason to stay distant. And after I didn't." I sat with that. One word. That's all it took. "It wasn't the word," he said. "It was what it made me feel when I heard it." He looked at me steadily. "I don't act on feelings. I observe them and I decide." A pause. That night I decided. He asked me to have dinner with him. A real dinner, not the booth at Harlow's, not coffee in an unremarkable midtown spot. but an actual restaurant on the Upper West Side where we sat at a table in the middle of the room and ordered from a real menu and existed in ordinary public space like two people who were simply having dinner together, which was both exactly what it was and not entirely that simple. His men were somewhere nearby. I'd accepted this as a fixed condition, the way you accept the presence of certain weather. Not comfortable exactly, but no longer startling. We talked about things I hadn't expected to talk about with him. He'd grown up partly in Seoul and partly in Los Angeles, moving between those two cities in a childhood that he described in sparse, careful language that told me there were parts of it he'd made peace with, and parts he hadn't. He'd studied economics for 2 years at UCLA before the life he was in now had pulled him in a different direction, which he didn't elaborate on and I didn't press. He had a younger sister in Seoul who sent him photographs of her children every week, and when he mentioned this, something in him softened in a way that was brief and genuine, and made him look for just a moment, like a person rather than a presence. "You love her," I said. "Yes," he said. No hesitation. "Do you get to see her?" "Not enough." I thought about what it cost, the life he lived, the edges he'd said he'd stand between me and, the things that came with the corner booth and the men in suits, and the car that was always there, and the careful, total awareness of every room he entered. I thought about what it meant to have built something that kept you safe, and also kept you separate, and how those two things were sometimes the same architecture. "Gunwoo," I said. He looked at me. "I'm not afraid of you," I said. "I want you to know that. I was at the beginning a little, but I'm not anymore." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know." "Does that complicate things? For you?" He looked at me across the table, and his expression was the one I'd finally named for myself sometime in the last 2 weeks. Recognition, yes, but also something more deliberate than that. The look of a person who had identified something valuable and had made a decision about how to hold it. "It simplifies them," he said. He drove me home that night. Not just to the corner, not just to the subway entrance, but all the way to my building in the Bronx, the black car pulling up to the ordinary, unremarkable block where I'd lived for 3 years. And when I reached for the door handle, he said my name once, quietly, and I stopped. "The job," he said. "When you get it. Don't let this..." A slight pause, the closest thing to hesitation I'd ever heard from him. "Don't let what's around me be a reason to make yourself smaller." I understood what he was saying, that his world had weight and shadow, and that the people near him sometimes disappeared into that shadow, and that he did not want that for me. That whatever this was, whatever was building between us in the space of restaurant booths and cold sidewalks, and texts that arrived before I'd finished thinking the thought, he wanted it to happen alongside my life, not instead of it. "I won't," I said. He nodded. I got out of the car. At my building door, I turned back, not sure why, just a reflex. The window was down, and he was looking at me with that steady, complete attention, the city dark behind him. "Good night." "Gunwoo," I said. "Good night, Amelia." Aldridge Communications called on Monday morning. I was on the subway when the call came in, jostled between strangers, bad signal cutting in and out, and I pressed the phone to my ear and said, "Yes, yes, I understand, yes," and hung up and stood in the moving train, with the offer ringing in my head and my eyes stinging in a way I was not going to explain to anyone around me. I texted him one word, "Yes." He responded immediately, and it was the first time in all of it, the notes and the cards and the declarative statements delivered like facts, that he sent me something that felt entirely unguarded. "I know. Congratulations." And then, after a short pause, a second message. "I'm proud of you." I read it twice, looked up at the tunnel rushing past the window, felt the particular fullness of a moment that doesn't announce itself as important, but that you know, even while it's happening, that you'll carry it for a long time. The train came out of the tunnel into gray morning light, the Bronx spreading out around the elevated tracks, and I was different than I'd been when I got on. Not because of the job, though the job was real, and mine and I'd earned it, but because somewhere between a word thrown carelessly across a restaurant and a man who had decided quietly and completely that I was worth watching over, I had stopped being afraid of my own wanting. I had wanted the job and I'd let myself have it. I had wanted to be known by someone and I'd sat down. I was still not entirely sure what Gunwoo Shin's world would ask of me, what shadows moved at its edges, what I'd eventually have to understand about the distance between who he was in a corner booth and who he was everywhere else. There were things ahead that I couldn't see clearly yet, but I knew something now that I hadn't known 14 months ago, standing in an empty marketing office watching people carry boxes to elevators. I was not someone who needed to make herself smaller to stay safe. The train moved through the morning. I put my phone in my pocket, and I didn't look back.